So hi everyone, my name is Kris Youakim. I'm a postdoc at Stockholm University working with Karin Lind, also part of the group with Irina Kushniruk, who just gave her talk. And I want to talk to you today about chemical and kinematic clustering in GALAH and Gaia data. I've been working with GALAH data for the past few months, and I'm mostly interested in looking in high dimensional space to use as much information as possible to find substructures and clusters in the Milky Way. And I just want to say that this work is largely expanding upon work that was done in 2018 by Janus Koss and many other GALAH members. So thanks to all of you for paving the way. So this is the GALAH footprint, which many of you are familiar with. It contains 9 nearby open and globular clusters, some of which were specifically targeted by GALAH and some of which were just serendipitously observed. And as you can see here, I'm plotting members collected from the literature in red, and they're all fairly concentrated for most of these clusters to some central body. And depending on the dynamical histories of these clusters, we might expect actually some stars to be stripped or shredded and lie in the outskirts of these clusters. But one issue is that it's very hard to find clusters in the outlying regions because of high contamination. So most methods that look for cluster members use a strong prior on spatial coordinates. And so the idea here is to ask the question, are there cluster members in the outskirts that are being hidden by Milky Way stars? And can we potentially find these using looking in high dimensional parameter space? And if we are able to find cluster members in the outskirts, this is very useful because it tells us about the dynamical interactions with these clusters and our Milky Way galaxy. It helps us to better constrain their physical properties, like their tidal radii, their masses, and also can help us to constrain simulations of interactions with clusters, accreted or otherwise, with our Milky Way potential. So why is GALAH a particularly good data set for this? Well, GALAH DR3 provides us with stellar parameters and chemical abundances for up to 30 different elements. When we combine this with the latest data release of Gaia, we also get many, many orbital and kinematic parameters as well, such as energy, eccentricity, distances, actions, angles, velocities, etc. As I briefly mentioned, GALAH focuses on bright stars, so it's a nearby sample, but we can still probe out to about 10 kiloparsecs for giants. And what we end up with is a large, high-quality, high-dimensional data set with which to investigate nearby substructures in the Milky Way. And one application of this is to find members outside of the central body of their parent cluster. So the method that I'm using here is the same that was implemented in Koss et al. 2018. It's a T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding, or TSNE for short. And many of you are likely already familiar with this method because it's been being used more and more in recent years in astronomical literature. But for those of you who aren't familiar, in brief, it's an unsupervised manifold learning algorithm that utilizes nonlinear dimensionality reduction. So one way to think of this, it's kind of like a principal component analysis, but doing it in a bit more of a complex nonlinear way. And this is a great algorithm because it's really easy to use, has very few hyperparameters to optimize, and it's very efficient and quick to run on large data sets with many dimensions. So just to give you a quick sort of conceptual idea of how this works, this is a paper I borrowed from, a plot I borrowed from Janus's paper, where we're showing how we can go from points that are clustered in high dimensional space, and we project them down into 2 dimensions, which is easier for us to interpret. And the axes are dimensionless, but the important thing to note is that stars that are nearby in this space are also clustered in higher dimensional space, because clustering signatures are preserved. And this doesn't necessarily have to be 3 dimensions to 2 dimensions. This can be n dimensions to 2 dimensions. And in our case, it's going to be about 23 chemical and kinematic dimensions that we're going to project it down to 2 dimensions. And the only limitation of this method is that it does not deal well with missing data. So we have to have an entry for every data column for every star. Okay, so following the methods from Kris et al. 2018, we select a 40-degree region around each cluster and then run TSNE on each region for each cluster. Now I do this for every cluster, but right now I'm going to focus on Omega Cen because it's a particularly interesting case and there isn't time to talk about more. But I can just briefly mention that this works for open clusters, globular clusters, and even accreted halo substructures like Gaia-Enceladus-Sausage and Enceladus. So in Yannis's paper, they did this purely chemically using 13 chemical elements as input into the TSNE. And you can see here, this is a very typical TSNE projection with lots of different structure at different scales, where the gray stars are the background stars within a 40-degree region around Omega Cen, and the red stars are literature members of Omega Cen. And you can see that they're fairly localized, but still they're not very, very tightly correlated in the projected space. And one addition that we've made here is to actually add kinematic parameters as inputs into the TSNE. And you can see here in the resulting map, this is from the current work that I'm doing. The members of Omega Cen, this is about 30 literature member stars, are very, very tightly clustered in this TSNE space. So the algorithm is finding these stars to be very, very clustered in high dimensional space. And the addition of the kinematic properties is especially useful for globular clusters like Omega Cen because it has a lot of abundance spreads. And also other globular clusters have abundance spreads in their light elemental abundances and so on. So the kinematics really help to improve the performance. And also to mention that Yannis Kos did this with GALAH DR1 and Gaia TGAS, and we're now doing this with GALAH DR3 and Gaia DR3. So we have much better chemistry and also kinematics for more stars. Now, the TSNE algorithm is stochastically initiated, which means that every time you run it, you get a slightly different mapping. So in order to make these results a bit more robust, we ran this analysis 1,000 times. And here I'm just showing you a sample of 16 such maps. And you can see that although the morphology, general morphology changes, rotates, the clustering of the Omega Cen stars, although it's a bit very hard to see here, is still successful in almost every single run. So what we do then is we compute statistical distances to the peak density of the Omega Cen literature stars, and then assign probabilities based on where stars fall. And so blue stars are going to be stars that are high probability members that fall close to the cluster, and orange stars are going to be slightly lower probability members. And then we can look at specific kinematic spaces to validate our results. So here I'm just showing you proper motion angle, proper motion amplitude, radial velocity, energy, distances, angular momentum, eccentricity, and a Keel diagram, where again, the red stars indicate Omega Cen, confirmed literature members. The gray stars are background Milky Way stars. And the blue and orange stars are candidates, with blue being the slightly higher candidate, higher probability candidates. And you can see that in almost all of these kinematic spaces, these candidates agree very well with being members of Omega Cen. Now, if we plot these stars on the sky, on the left-hand side here, you can see, again, the orange dots being slightly lower probability candidates, the blue stars slightly higher probability, and red are the confirmed literature members of Omega Cen. We see some kind of very interesting, almost stream-like structure. If we look to the right-hand side, this is a recent paper by Rodrigo Ibata, where they use n-body simulations to connect Omega Cen to a nearby stellar stream. So the black points here are simulated data. The red points are actual real candidates found by the stream finder algorithm to the Fimbulful stream. And in this paper, Ibata et al. Claim that the omega-sen Hilbert cluster is a progenitor, a potential possible progenitor for the film-Bothel stream. Here I'm now plotting the film-Bothel candidates, and here I'm showing you another sample from a recent paper by Jeffrey Simpson, where they chemically tag 5 stars using GALAH to show also a chemical connection between film-Bothel stars and omega-sen stars. And they even find a couple of stars here in this high crowding region where a stream finder does not work. And I just want to point out that one of the stars, one of our candidates, is actually a recovery of one of Jeffrey's stars as well. So here, somewhat surprisingly, we're seeing a lot of the candidates on the other side. So not where the simulation would predict the stream to be, but on the other side, on the trailing end. So these are very recent results, and I'm investigating exactly what this means, but this is potentially another very interesting connection between omega-sen and this film-Bothel stream. So the next steps, of course, are to look in more detail at the detailed chemical properties of these candidate stars, as well as the specific orbits. We can integrate the orbits and see if they follow an orbital path that's consistent with this stream. And that brings me to my summary. So following the methods of Kris et al. 2018, we use TSNE to explore the outskirts of globular and open clusters in GALAH and Gaia DR3. We include both chemistry and kinematics as inputs into the TSNE and perform 1,000 fiducial iterations to obtain membership probabilities for cluster stars, and show that this works well for open clusters, globular clusters, and accreted halo substructures alike. We find member candidates for multiple clusters, even though I didn't have time to show them here, and find an interesting feature that may connect omega-sen and the film-Bothel stream. Looking to the future, this analysis can easily be extended to any high-dimensional data sets with chemistry and kinematics, such as, for example, weave and foremost. And thank you. That's all I have.
Thanks, Kris. And we already have a first question by Tillman. You want to read it out yourself again?
Sure, I can read it out, but we can also wait a bit if someone else first has a question or want to type slower, or I can fill the time by reading my question.
Yeah, I mean, Jane, of course, has a question or had raised her hand.
Yes, please, then go ahead. I just have the last question.
Actually, I have pretty much the same question as the Tillman.
Ah, okay, good. Great, then.
Then I just read my question out, or so. Right. Hi, Kris. Very nice talk. Cool results. Nice method. I was wondering, you combine chemical information, dynamical information, eccentricity, which just have different units. How do you combine them? Like, how do you scale them or weight them to make them all into TSNE? And how sensitive is TSNE to this choice of scaling?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Tillman. Of course, this is a blind, unsupervised machine learning algorithm, so it doesn't know about units, it doesn't know about scale, it doesn't know about logarithmic quantities. So when you pass it, for example, abundances and kinematic parameters, you have to somehow scale these to be on the same scale. And a large part of the work of this is actually pre-processing the data, because the actual code to run the TSNE is like 4 lines of Python. So here I'm showing you a plot of all of the parameters that we pass in. So some chemistry and also some kinematic properties. And a very common method used for pre-processing machine learning data is to do something called standardizing the data, where you basically just scale all of your values such that your distribution has a median of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. Of course, this gets a bit funky if you have really, really strange distributions, but you can see it's relatively well behaved here for most of our parameters. And another part of this method that I borrowed from Yannis's work is that you can also add weights. So then you can multiply your distributions by some weight, depending on which parameters you think are more or less important. And you can play with this a little bit to see which combination of processing of the input parameters gives you the best results.
Okay, we have another question by Kirsten Banks. First of all, she says that was really interesting. And she asked whether you have currently have thoughts on why we haven't found stars from the stream near Omega Cen, where they are predicted to be in the model.
Yeah, great question. So I think Jeffrey Simpson's paper sort of looked at this and did find a couple of stars that were in this region. And to be honest with you, when I first, my slideshow is not working very well. Okay. Right, so Jeffrey stars are here where you would expect them to be in the model. But yeah, interestingly, none of the candidates, or sorry, one of the candidates here is in that region, but the rest are on the other side. I don't know, actually. This is interesting. Maybe we could be seeing some kind of projection effects, possibly, so the stream kind of continues in this way, or this could be maybe some kind of wrap. It's difficult to say until we look a bit more into this. But yeah, it's a bit puzzling why there are no stars in this region. And to be honest with you, when I first made this plot, I had the RA axis inverted, so all of my stars fell right where the simulation had predicted, and I thought, oh wow. And then I fixed the bug and then thought, oh, double wow, they're on the other side. What does this mean? So I'm still trying to figure out exactly what this means, but it's interesting for sure.
Cool, thanks. Jeffrey, you have a question?
I was going to weigh in with, I would potentially blame Galah's selection as the problem, because we're only going down to 14th magnitude. That isn't very far down the giant branch. And so there aren't a lot of stars. Omega Cen's a pretty big thing, but there aren't a lot of giant stars in any particular cluster. It could just be a numbers problem as to why we're not seeing stars in that near the cluster. Because this is something that people looked at, like Gary has been used A Omega and things for a long time to try and map the tidal distributions of stars around Omega Cen, and there just aren't a huge number of them. So I would blame Galah.
Yeah, for sure. And a big part of going forward with this is to, of course, check and make sure that there are no sort of systematics with the Galah data that are causing some features or some false detection of candidates. So this may mean reanalyzing select spectra for candidates, looking in detail at their chemical abundances and making sure nothing weird is going on. Yeah, that's the next step.
And then there is one last question by Yannis.
Maybe not that much of a question. Maybe you can just elaborate that it might also be Disney's problem. Did you try running Disney with just kinematic information? Because for clusters like Omega Cen, you should be getting similar results. And then did you also try taking out proper motion and radial velocity and parameters like that? Because in this case, when you include these parameters, you're actually trying to find a very stretched group in a multidimensional space. Because those blue and orange stars on your plot, they have very different radial velocity, for example, or proper motions than Omega Cen stars, right?
Okay, so the first part of your question, did I try with just kinematics? Yes, I did. And I don't remember exactly. The results were slightly worse, but they were still quite good for Omega Cen. In fact, I tried with just chemistry and the results were not very good. So the main power was in the kinematics. And the second part of your question, I think actually if you sort of don't look too much at this middle panel, these are Korn-Baylor-Jones distances. So they're subject to some very strong priors, Milky Way priors. But if you look at the other panels, especially the blue histograms, I know they're hard to see, but they're actually very, very much consistent with the radial velocities of Omega Cen. And Omega Cen is especially nice for this method and for kinematics because it has kinematics and orbital parameters that are so distinct from the background star. So it's very high rate of velocity, highly negative energies, etc. And the proper motions, maybe there's one star we might exclude based on proper motion angle here from the high candidate sample, but the others are pretty much bang on where they're supposed to be. And in proper motions, I guess it wouldn't be outrageous to think that they could be slightly off in angle and amplitude based on some kind of projection or orbital phase on their orbits. So yeah, one thing to try, as you suggested, is to exclude proper motions and other parameters from the analysis and see if we can still recover the stars. I have not done that, but that's the next step as well to check that. And by the way, nice to meet you, Yannis. Thanks for your nice paper.